a year ago, the board unanimously adopted a equity resolution committing the county to work on an equitable approach to decision making, with a focus on trying to address disparities in outcomes. And so what I'm going to do right now, without further flourish, is turn it over to Samia Bird, our Chief Race and Equity Officer, who has a presentation, and then I will have a few slides towards the end talking about some additional issues. So over to you, Ms. Bird.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the board. I've been before you all many times over the years as a principal planner or deputy county manager. And as the manager said, today I'm here before you as Chief Race and Equity Officer. And so we are going to share with you some things that have transpired over the past year, and then talk a little bit about where we are and a racial equity plan and framework for moving forward. And so I'm going to share a few slides here. Sorry. A moment. Not working. Let me try again.
That's okay. We have some background static or something, I think. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but probably not.
It's possible. I'm going to, is anything happening yet? No.
No. That's all right.
Okay, give me one moment, one more time.
Absolutely.
Samia, I'm gonna come to your rescue. I'm gonna try.
Okay, great. Do you have?
Yeah, I have. Oh, yeah, I have. Hold on one second. Let's see if this works.
We're all holding on. Ooh, there's Ms. Aha.
Yes.
That looks correct. Yes?
Yes.
Excellent.
Great.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so you can advance to the next slide. Okay, great. So I wanted to take a look back at where we have come over the past year. So back in September 29, as the manager mentioned, the board adopted an equity resolution, and it indicated the board and the county's commitment to equity, and there were a number of directives as to what that means and how. Also, starting in September 2019, about the same time the resolution was adopted, and through July 2020, we participated in the learning cohort. And when we adopted the resolution, we had GARE come and actually present in advance of that. It was 10 months, and I actually have Battalion Chief Wesley here with me, and she can talk a little bit more about the cohort program in a moment. In March of 2020, the county board had a work session on equity with Mitch Landreau, the former mayor of New Orleans, and the founder of E Pluribus Unum, an organization specifically focusing on assisting elected officials to lead for equity. And this was sort of a kickoff to our budget work sessions with the different departments. Then in July of 2020, the manager created a new position for the county, Chief Race and Equity Officer. And then in August of this year, we had a leadership training with senior leaders and executive leadership team, as well as some of the board members who participated in that, focusing with GARE on leading to advance race and equity. Next slide. So the equity resolution set forth a number of directives for the manager, and also that we would report back to the board September 2020 on our progress. So as listed here on this slide, periodically we were to report back on the learning cohort. And over the 10-month program, we were before the board bringing a manager's report, I think 6 times is what I recall. Each time we had different staff sharing their experiences and learning, and we will have, as I mentioned before, Battalion Chief Wesley to provide more about that. And she was the lead for our cohort, and she'll give you a brief update on how that program ended. The other bullet here was to develop a racial equity tool for use in policy practice and budget decisions. The sub-bullets here were actually listed in the resolution as examples of things that we might do. So the pilot project the cohort is working on is intended to serve as one tool, with the pilot really to be a way for them to apply and refine the tool so that it could work specifically for Arlington. Capacity building and organizational structure, it is determining what needs to be put in place to advance racial equity within the structure of the government. And as mentioned before, in July, the manager appointed a chief race and equity officer. And that's the beginning of working to determine how to advance racial equity within our institution of government and what our capacity needs are in the structure. The framework for the racial equity plan, in many ways, that was the resolution in some respects, but I'm going to speak a little bit more about my work plan, which serves as the racial equity framework and a plan for how we are to move forward. And then finally, applying a racial equity lens to department lines of business as part of our FY21 budget and CIP processes. So in March, we had a number of departments before you, including the work sessions in their slides for their work sessions, an approach to how they focused on equity, and they were to look at those 4 questions: who benefits, who's burdened, who's missing, and how do we know? And this was just before the pandemic that we were able to at least have a few of our departments present. And what I recall is that for those work sessions, we had CPHD, DHS, DES, as well as DPR and DTS. They included in their presentations a slide focusing on equity and budget considerations. And so the other thing that we focused on is when there was a discussion on the CIP with the board back in July, we did include deliberately and intently a slide about equity with respect to stormwater and the considerations there. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Battalion Chief Wesley to give you a brief update on the learning cohort, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about the new role and the plans moving forward.
Thank you.
Good evening to the board. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to reiterate where our program is. We started with a 10-month learning program with 13 staff across departments to include APS. And that cohort, if you remember, we were sharing within and across departments very valuable information. And currently where we are, because of the pandemic, we are not finished our pilot project, which is we are focusing on workforce diversity among leadership. But we are still tracking along, meeting regularly, and we're still waiting our data. And as soon as we have that, we're going to be able to present our finished project. We have all also committed to continue to help Samia in her efforts, and so we're still going to continue with our cohort. There will be a new implementation cohort with the COG region starting from September 20th through June of 2021, and a new introductory learning cohort with a date to be determined. But as I just shared, everyone on my team has committed to continue with the work, to continue to assist in other departments as they go forward and present in the equity projects. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully the sound is a little better.
It's good.
Good. Okay. So I wanted to now talk a little bit about the Chief Race and Equity Officer position. And I often find myself in a position when I'm talking about it to let people know what it is and what it is not. And so this position is not intended to be a compliance officer. I'm not going to be focusing on individual resident or employee concerns, even though it's helpful to understand what some of the broader issues may be. That is not the focus of this particular position. Not the expert, not the only one doing the work, and not going to be able to fix racism by myself. So what I will be doing is leading, convening, organizing, and then working to coordinate the efforts for all of us to advance equity within the government and in partnership with the community. I'm focusing specifically on laying the foundation to address systemic racism and where and how it shows up, and then focusing on organizational from the perspective of policies, procedures, practices, and in partnership with the community, as I mentioned before. Next slide. So the framework of a racial equity plan is pretty much my approach, which is if you can advance marks, they will come up. Normalizing, so that we would have a shared understanding, knowledge, and nomenclature around racial equity within the organization as well as among the community. Next. Organize, that we would have a sustainable and supported structure to advance racial equity to include our personnel and resources that become a defined and integral component of the organization and the system. Next. Operationalize, that racial equity is a matter of principle in developing and considering the impact that our policies, plans, and decisions have on all of our residents as well as our employees. And that at the end of the day, every employee, resident, and person who interacts with the county can see themselves in the work, the process, the system, and the structure. And last, assess. So this is shown in a circle because this work is continuous. We're going to constantly be normalizing, organizing, operationalizing, but it's all going to be based on assessing. So starting with an assessment, continually assessing to be able to measure our progress and make relevant adjustments in continued advancement. So we may be doing all of these things at the same time. We may be doing some of them one at a time, but it is a continuous cycle because this is not an initiative. It's not a one-off or a checkbox, but all of these things we will continually have to do. Next slide. And if you advance one by one again. And so applying a racial equity lens intentionally, consistently, and constantly, we can start to change our mindset and thinking on how we should approach our work. And so this is the tool. I think this is a great tool. We started with these questions in our resolution, and there's something that I think we all need to start to utilize. It's one of the things we can do almost immediately. Ask the questions every step of the way, at every decision, at the beginning of a process, middle, and end. Who benefits? Who is burdened? Who is missing? And how do we know? And I've actually added another question to this, because once we know, to make sure that we continue to stay top of mind and action oriented, the next question I've added, and what did we do? So it's not enough to just gather the information to ask the questions and know about it, but we have to then take a next step and actually put something into action and respond. Next. And next slide. So,
I wonder if I think, this might be a good place to take a pause, Ms. Bird. And before we kind of go to the moving forward, you've covered a lot. I'd like to invite colleagues perhaps to see if they have any questions or comments and then move forward. Does that work for you?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe go back to, this is fine, but I'd like to sort of look a little bit about where we've been and see. I'm suspecting there may be some questions or comments before we move forward. So, Ms. Crystal, I see your hand up. But you're muted. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Ms. Bird, I'm really excited about this work and so thrilled to have you in this particular piece of leadership at this time in the county. You had mentioned in one of the items in the slide was the effort to review our departmental budget proposals and CIP proposals through that equity lens. I know that work kind of began this year. I wondered if you could say a couple more sentences about how that will look and how departmental leadership is being prepared to ask those questions and shape budget proposals that reflect the results of those questions and a prioritization of equity.
So that's a big question, especially given what we are dealing with now. It was definitely, I think, when that was part of the resolution and we started on that path, the beginning of the budget process for FY21, there was a lot of kind of consternation about, well, what do these questions mean and how do we apply it and what do we do? And, I think departments struggle with that because it is a big question and it's a very different approach to budget than what we have done in the past. We're very focused on projects or programs and not necessarily focused on how we think in terms of applying equity to our programs and projects. And what does that mean in terms of how we shift our thoughts about how we will actually put forward things for budget? And so having those questions out there, I think it's still going to take quite a bit of time to be able to work through, to train staff, to understand how they look at the budget in that way and change their thinking, quite frankly, and their mindset in terms of the approach. Training certainly is one of the things we would like to be able to do. We've been looking at a number of other jurisdictions and how they've approached this, and I will say that it's not been easy in any of the places we looked at. And they've all struggled, from what we can tell, with this, looking at listservs and, just being a part of conversations with other jurisdictions. It's a huge thing to tackle, but something I think that we need to continue to talk about and really focus on people understanding what those 4 questions mean and how they start to apply them and what that's going to mean in terms of the outcomes. They're going to look different than what people are used to. And are people prepared to present something different, I think, is a lot of the challenge in the question.
I know in Fairfax, their chief equity officer ended up pursuing a model of sort of a consultancy almost, right? Folks who would sort of sit in with their departments and help them go through that analysis. Do you think there's a possibility that the folks who've participated now in this GARE cohort, like Ms. Leslie, who's on with us, and who now have some expertise in guiding these questions, could sort of go back to their departments and help facilitate those conversations?
I think that's a possibility. One of the things that I've been looking at is how do we leverage the experience and the expertise that some of our cohort members did receive and deploy those within their departments, and looking at a little bit of what is a good structure to help to undergird some of the work in departments so that they can actually start to be hands-on. That is definitely a good approach. And I see Tiffany has her hand up if you want to weigh in.
And I should say Commander Wesley, right? Not Ms. Wesley.
Oops.
Chief Wesley, yes. And that's a great question. We have started in the fire department. We started a racial equity initiative, and it's 3 particular focus groups. And I'm the co-facilitator and also the liaison between the group and Samia, the chief equity officer. So I think that's going to be a great model in which we can follow to kind of share, how to do that liaison, make sure we're always tracking back to our chief equity officer, making sure we're in line with the GARE principles as well as our county and organization principles.
That's great. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Dorsey, I think you're up next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Ms. Bird, just really thrilling body of work, and I love the inclusion of the 5th question as a critical piece in the assessment part of this work, which I know usually gets a lot less attention, but is nonetheless important. And I just want to, point out or just remind everyone that the grand plans that we had last September for how we expected this year would roll out got interrupted by, the co-occurring crises that we're dealing with, and as a result, we have stood up a lot of efforts that I think have very much been informed by the growing sensitivity and understanding of racial equity as applied to our COVID response specifically. So I would just put out a plea that somehow we begin thinking as early as possible about how we assess the appropriateness and the quality of our COVID responses that have very much been driven by an equity perspective. My sense is that they're good, but I don't want to just rely on that assessment. I would love a professional way to think about all that we've done to try and manage the pandemic. And, not that you don't have a number of things on your to-do list, but helping us think through that would be extremely beneficial from my point of view.
Thank you. It's interesting because in a lot of ways, like you said, that has helped to kind of structure some very essentials and, basics in terms of how we look at what really is needed for everyone to achieve a certain quality of life that's equitable. And so that does help to inform, I think, a lot of things moving forward. And we've put a lot of good things in place that I think we can build upon.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Karantanis.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Bird, for presenting and updating us on this. I appreciate a lot your work. I wanted to follow up on Ms. Crystal's and Mr. Dorsey's questions. So one of the questions in the set of 5 questions that bothers me the most is the how do we know? because in order to know, one of the biggest tricks that government had always in the pocket was, we don't know. The answer, we don't know. And we usually didn't know because we didn't ask. And usually we didn't ask who we should be asking and who could provide the right information, the right answers. So how do we include our community in that? I was very encouraged to see that finally our commissions are meeting again, and several of them, Planning Commission first and foremost, have engaged already, and they are, taking up equity very, very seriously. They even reworking their charters. So how can we open the gates, the doors to our community to engage with our process?
So I think there are a couple things that I wanted to respond to in what you said. The first one about how do we know, one of the things that we talked about a lot through GARE and we learned is the importance of data and collecting data. And I think, for many, many years, it was taboo to ask people about their race or their ethnicity. So we didn't collect the data, and we could say we didn't know because, we can't ask that. Well, now we have to be intentional about figuring out what data do we need to collect and be okay with asking it. And not with the intent of, doing any harm, but to be able to understand whether or not there are any racialized outcomes in any of the work that we're doing, whether we know not necessarily intended to, but that may be a result, so that then we can respond accordingly by maybe changing our direction or our policy or our approach or what have you based on what the data is telling us. So that's one thing. In terms of engaging the community, I've been meeting with a lot of different people in the community, and one of the things that I really like to remind people is that, engaging the community, we always focus on kind of a certain model where we maybe focus on people knowing or email or, a certain way of approaching or reaching people that doesn't reach everyone. And so when are we going to start to actually meet people where they are, take approaches of going out to people, going out to the community, actually becoming more relational and more hands-off and talking to people, getting to know people who are not like us in different neighborhoods and different communities, and finding out why they're not participating in the process. What are the barriers to them participating in the process? Is it the time of day that we have meetings? Is it where we have our meetings? Is it, how we have our meetings? Is it that they don't have childcare? Is it that they are working during those times? And how do we respond to them in a way that makes it more accessible? And quite honestly, are the barriers also things related to race? That, they are not comfortable with government or they don't trust government and they'd rather participate in different ways. And we're not going to know that if we don't connect with people in different ways and become a little bit more intentional to do that and relational with them. It was interesting. I talked to the pedestrian and bicycle advisory commissions last week, and they were asking, how can we become more diverse in our membership? And I said, well, you do know Black and brown people, they bike and they walk too. How, we can talk to them, find out there are groups of Black people and brown people who bike. Can you do some research? Can you educate yourself on, where they are and what they do and how you might be able to connect with them and just build relationships with them to bring them into the fold? So I think that's a lot of way in terms of how we might be able to start engaging. It really is going to start with trying to make connections to people more directly, intentionally, and in different ways, and focusing on understanding the areas or what I like to call the lines of business. So the different areas and the ways people focus on those areas. What do you understand about the commission or the area that you're representing more broadly than your perspective, but from other people's perspective? And educate yourself on that so you know how to then move forward in outreaching to people in different ways, in different spaces and places, quite honestly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Excellent answer, Ms. Bird. Appreciate that. Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Bird, I'm thrilled with the work. It brings back to mind each of us individually sat in and for part of the early August conversation, and it is bringing the strength of that time right back to mind. I love the question, what did we do? The one thought I had based on another conversation that I had is that sort of related to Ms. Crystal's point is that this work is evolving, so I just wonder if you have, I'm guessing you've thought of the sort of benefits that could come with having a check-in with colleagues in other jurisdictions doing this work. I had a specific conversation in August with someone who's been doing this work for years, and I was struck by what a resource it could be, as this is such a fast evolving area and also so important, that I just put in a plug for that. Sounds like you're already there, but I may have a resource that you can consider that would be your choice, of course, but there's someone who's that I know with Leadership Greater Washington who's been doing this for a while and could provide a benefit, I think. So
thank you. Yeah, no, it is. So networks and resources are always welcome. That was one of the benefits, and is one of the benefits, I think, of GARE, is that it's a networking organization and sharing of resources and networks across the jurisdiction. And the cohort program was really intended to be one that was regionally based, so that there could be more of a regional collaboration and sharing on equity. And so I definitely appreciate that. I am connected with and in touch with colleagues in other jurisdictions in Virginia and Maryland who are doing this work, because the other thing is it's hard, right? And so having support and resources is necessary, and especially in order to be able to sustain the work and yourself in the work over a period of time. So I definitely appreciate that.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll build a little bit on that network. Ms. Bird, would you like to touch just a little bit on your work with Aaron Rodgers and the school system? Because I believe you've been doing some collaboration, and I think that's obviously an important part of our community as well.
Yes, Madam Chair. So Aaron Gregory is
great. Oops, Aaron Rodgers. Oh yeah, that's sports. Sorry, my mother's favorite. Sorry. Yeah.
He is the Chief Diversity and Equity Officer for Arlington Public Schools, and he is newer to the area as well as new to his role with APS. He is part of our learning cohort. So one of the things that we did was make sure we were intentional about having APS part of the cohort. We would do the same with the implementation cohort and any new cohort that goes forward for introductory learning. We have some really good and strong people partnering with us from APS in our cohort program. And Aaron and I have continued to talk because we, looking a lot at how Fairfax has approached their work, has been the One Fairfax model, where it's the school system as well as the county government, and they approached it together. I mean, they've been on the journey for quite a long time, so a little bit different in how they set that up from the very beginning. But we both have talked about the importance of being connected, staying connected, and sharing and networking to make sure that we are coordinated as a county in terms of what schools is doing and what the county is doing moving forward. So we would continue to strengthen that relationship.
Thank you very much. And I know that was going on. I just want to make sure people, we touch on that. And I'll have to tell my mother about my little slip here. So, I really appreciate all this. I know we want to move on. You touched about how it's not easy, this work. And, when we're actually trying to put it in budget, how people are struggling to try to incorporate it. And I think sometimes when we adopt these 4 questions, people think, well, all right, so we answer the 4 questions and we're done. And then you add, what did we do? Of course, that makes it a little dicier. But frankly, if you had come here and were presenting and saying things were just going swimmingly and it was really, people were adapting quickly and it was working out well, I really wouldn't trust what you were saying, because this is hard work. And I think it's not until we actually get into it that a lot of people realize how difficult it is. I also think the Pollyanna in me, or the positive person, that this pandemic and, of course, the terrible murder of George Floyd and all of the things coming out of that, it's made a lot of people realize that systemic racism really is a thing. I think a lot of people, they kind of just thought it was just sort of a buzzword and it didn't really exist. I think people understand a lot better. And I think they're seeing the current crisis is making us see the need, where it's so clear it's the most vulnerable who are really having the hardest time that we really need to work with. And surprise, surprise, they're mostly people of color. So I think in many ways the pandemic is helping in an odd way. And I'm so glad we're doing this work. So I interrupted you in the middle of your presentation. Would you like to continue now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Yeah.
And let's see, I can maybe get the share back. Oh, there you go, Lynn. Okay, thank you, Lynn. So here, I just wanted to talk about a few things in terms of how we're moving forward. So the first thing is focusing on a series of facilitated conversations on race and racism within the community as well as with the staff in the county. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the community effort separate from this. But, you know, we've seen that there have been a lot of conversations that have been happening organically throughout the organization that we facilitated in some way. Groups that form that are doing a lot of reading, watching videos, and having conversations, I think is great. But if we want to start talking about race and racism more intentionally, having facilitated conversations just to make sure we're not doing harm, I think will be important. Education and training on race and racism. So one of the things that we would love to be able to do, while it was great that we could send people to a learning cohort, and we have another one, we have a large organization, and I think it's important that everyone is rooted and grounded in the same understanding of what we mean when we say race and racism, and receive the same level of training and education on how we advance racial equity in government. One of the other things that is happening as well is each department is currently in a space where they are trying to work through, okay, how within our department and how do we advance it? And I know there are certain differences for a lot of departments, their line of business and the way they approach work. And I think that that is great that they are doing that. We see a lot of departments setting up steering committees, groups to focus specifically on race and equity. And one of the things that I think is important is that if we're going to move forward together and be coordinated is to have a core team that is a working group that can make sure that the work happening at the department level is connected to a broader plan and goals. So the goals that I set out in terms of the framework for our plan, making sure that we're all connected to that so that we're all moving forward in the same way, in the same direction, and having a group that's cross departments that can help to work through that plan and think about how we implement that at the department level is going to be really important. And then in addition to that, thinking through whether or not there needs to be equity leads or champions within each department, or it's enough to have a core team that helps us with the planning work. The other thing is, in order for us to be able to regularly assess where we are and how we're doing, we have to have some sort of a baseline understanding of people's perceptions and understandings on race and equity, but then also continually do that over the course of time so that we can continue to evaluate how we're doing, what progress we're making, where we are. So two things is one, which I'll also talk about in a moment, is the same thing with the community, understanding what the community thinks and perceives about race and racism and what issues they understand or see that we may be having helps us to focus our efforts in some ways. But then similarly within the organization. And so GARE has a survey tool that we would like to look at and see whether or not we would like to use that for our organization. And I'll talk about what we'll do with the community in a moment. And then the next thing is, just making sure that we can establish, and I can establish some allies, some relationships, and look for funding opportunities as well to help sustain this work over time. And then also being able to find partnerships and establish partnerships with the community to do this work, because I am in a unique position of balancing work with the community while also working within the organization. So that's a pretty huge lift. So having partners and allies is something that we really would like to be able to move forward and do. And like I mentioned, I'm doing a lot of talking, a lot of listening, meeting with a lot of different groups to just, share my thoughts and ideas and plans, and then understand from them where they are and how we might be able to partner together. Next. And so this next slide, I want to talk about what we're doing, which I'm really excited about, is a series of conversations to begin with an assessment with the community, and we're calling it Building Dialogue on Race and Equity. So we're going to be partnering with Challenging Racism, who has a curriculum place based on how you have challenging conversations about race and how you can learn and educate and talk about race in the community. We're going to start that process probably in the fall. Hopefully in the next several weeks, we will have more information and details about that. But starting that with a sampling of attitudes and perspectives, as I mentioned, with the community, asking a number of targeted questions to understand what people's thoughts and perceptions are about race and racism in Arlington, what some of the issues are, and be able to have that leading into the first thing we're going to a series of conversations that are more broad about race and equity in Arlington, generally speaking. The other thing we want to do is to be able to partner with community leaders to help them build their capacity to then be able to have conversations and train their members and in their sphere of influence about race and equity as well. So another series of conversations with partners and leaders. And then developing what we call sort of a toolkit so that any individual can have conversations with their neighbors, with their friends, with their family, and they can use this toolkit on race and equity, because one of the other things, as I mentioned before, in having these conversations is important for them to in some ways be guided and informed so that we're not doing more harm. And then the last thing is throughout each of these conversations and these series of conversations, we will be assessing where we are, getting feedback from people on how they felt the conversations went, gauging their opinions and understanding, and be able to roll that up into an overall report on what we heard, what we know, what we understand, and then maybe make some recommendations about some things that we can do moving forward with the community on race and equity. And so the next slide. So I just wanted to leave this slide here, which is, again, we are just now in the process of starting to set up our information for our challenging racism conversations to go forward. So for more information, if you want to sign up, when we have that available, you can go to www.challengingracism.org/DRE. And for people who want to just follow what we're doing and learn more, we're going to continue to build on our current website, which the link is listed here. And people can always contact me as well, and my information is on this slide. And the next slide I just want to leave this here for a minute. It's the quote that I have been leaning on. It is my quote. And I think it's just really important for us to remember that we are on a journey. It is not going to be easy. It is very challenging work. It's constantly evolving. And if we're looking to do something that is sustainable and make some changes to our system for the long term, we really need to be patient, persistent, and persevere.